Imagine trying to build a 100-story skyscraper. Right.
Yeah.
But the chemical formula for the concrete foundation changes every single morning.
Yeah, you would think the entire building would just instantly collapse.
Exactly. I mean, you wouldn't even clear the first floor. But when you step into the world of generative AI, that is not only how the building gets constructed, it is, well, quite literally the only way to build.
Right.
So, welcome to the deep dive. I am just so thrilled you're joining us today because we are completely throwing out the usual news catch-up. Today is an intellectual exploration of how we even begin to wrap our heads around a field that is mutating right in front of our eyes.
It really requires a completely different mindset. I mean, if you are trying to navigate this space with a static, printed map, you're already lost. The territory is moving.
It is moving so fast, and to figure out how to map a moving territory, we are looking at a highly concentrated, incredibly specific piece of text today. It's an excerpt titled "The Foundations and State of Generative AI Research."
Yeah, and we should clarify, we aren't looking at a massive textbook chapter here.
No, not at all. We are looking at a singular mission statement. The author declares their focus is on, quote, sharing the papers on Gen AI-related topic with a very, laser-focused emphasis on, quote, especially the SOTA papers that are the foundations of Gen AI work.
It is a remarkably dense sentence.
Right.
Every single word in that mission statement is doing heavy lifting. And, the reason you should care about this exact phrasing is that it actually offers a survival guide.
It's a survival guide. I like that.
Yeah, because we are living in a moment of absolute information overload. Everyone with a keyboard is suddenly an armchair AI expert.
Oh, absolutely. The hype cycle is out of control.
Right. So understanding the framework this text lays out the tension between what is foundational and what is state-of-the-art, that's the ultimate shortcut to bypassing the noise and becoming genuinely well-informed.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the very first part of that philosophy, the specific act of sharing the papers. Because that verb choice, it jumped right out at me. The text doesn't say summarizing the news. It doesn't say, giving you my opinion on the latest tech trends. It explicitly advocates for sharing the primary research.
Yeah.
And I want to pause on that because I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes rely really heavily on secondary sources. We read the article about the breakthrough rather than looking at the breakthrough itself.
Which is a totally natural human instinct. I mean, secondary sources are digestible. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is making a really profound argument about how to build genuine technical intuition.
Right. Think about it like a restaurant.
Okay.
If you want to know how a dish is made, you don't read a Yelp review of the restaurant.
Oh.
You certainly don't read a blog post from someone who talked to a guy who ate there once.
Mm-hmm.
You walk into the kitchen, you look at the chef's actual recipe, and you see the splattered grease on the ingredient list.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Yeah, reading the actual research papers gets you straight into the kitchen.
Reading the news is looking at the Yelp review. Reading the paper is looking at the ingredient list. And what's fascinating here is that historically, the scientific kitchen was completely closed to the public.
Oh yeah, tightly locked up.
For centuries, primary research was locked behind exorbitant academic paywalls, or written in language so esoteric that you needed 3 postgraduate degrees just to read the abstract.
Oh, absolutely. The gatekeeping was intense. You had to wait for the institutional translation to come out.
But this text's explicit mission of sharing these papers implies a radical democratization of knowledge. The author is basically suggesting that in Gen AI, the gatekeepers are gone.
Wow, yeah.
When researchers publish today, they're essentially putting their methodologies out into the open for immediate public scrutiny and adaptation. They're saying, hey, here is the raw data, here is the math, here is the exact logic we used. Look at it yourself.
Hang on, let me stop you there because I have to push back just a little on this idea of democratization.
Okay, go for it.
Sure, the papers are open, but let's be real here. They are still heavily technical.
It's
true.
They are filled with complex math and really dense architectural diagrams. For someone trying to keep up with their industry, isn't telling them to just go read the research papers a bit, intimidating? Doesn't that just create a completely different kind of gatekeeping?
That is a very fair point, and it's a super common hesitation. But I think the text's emphasis on sharing addresses exactly that fear. It implies a community effort. You do not need to sit down and solve every differential equation in a 20-page academic paper to extract its value.
So what are we actually looking for then, if not the math?
You are looking for the paradigm shift.
Yep.
You're looking at the introduction and the conclusion to understand the core problem they were trying to solve.
Yeah.
You're looking at the methodology to see, oh, they stopped trying to make the system memorize data, and instead they taught it to recognize patterns in this completely new way.
I see.
When you engage with primary sources, even just by skimming the architecture of the argument,
Yeah.
you start to recognize the actual mechanics of the technology.
You bypass the panic or the hype of a news headline that says AI achieves sentience. And you see the reality, which is usually, no, they just optimized a routing algorithm.
Which is so much more grounded. It takes the magic out of it in a good way. It turns it back into engineering.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the specific type of engineering papers the excerpt focuses on. It introduces an acronym that we really need to define for this context. It prioritizes the SOTA papers, SOTA, state-of-the-art.
Right, the SOTA papers.
Now, I know most of our audience knows generally what state-of-the-art means, but how does that term function differently here?
It is a critical distinction. In casual conversation, we use state-of-the-art as a marketing buzzword.
Yeah, like a state-of-the-art television.
Or a state-of-the-art smartphone. It just means shiny and new. But in this specific academic and research context, state-of-the-art, or SOTA, is a rigorously defended title. It is the reigning champion of a very specific benchmark.
Like holding the world record for the 100-meter dash.
Precisely. If a paper claims its new model is SOTA for, say, language translation, it is functionally declaring to the scientific community. As of the exact date this paper is published, this specific architecture is the most accurate, most efficient method known to humanity for solving this one specific problem.
Okay. Oh.
It is a measurable, empirical claim.
Okay, so a SOTA paper represents the absolute bleeding edge tip of human knowledge for that niche.
Yes.
But here is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, where my brain completely stalled out when I was reading this text.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The author says they are sharing the SOTA papers that are the foundations of Gen AI work. Let me just admit some raw confusion here.
Yeah.
I don't understand how those two concepts can coexist in the same sentence.
They seem mutually exclusive, don't they?
They do. Because, conceptually, a foundation is the oldest, most settled, most boring part of any structure. A foundation is the thing you lay down, wait for it to cure, and then never look at again. If I am building that skyscraper we talked about earlier, I do not want a cutting-edge foundation. I want immovable rock.
Exactly. You want stability.
Right. And by definition, if something is state-of-the-art today, it inevitably becomes outdated tomorrow. The cutting edge is always moving forward. So how on earth can the absolute temporary cutting edge simultaneously serve as a permanent foundation?
And that tension you're feeling right there, that apparent contradiction, is exactly what makes this text so profound. It reveals the utterly unique, almost reality-bending nature of generative AI compared to the entire history of human science.
Tell me more about that historical contrast because, well, in traditional sciences, the foundations took centuries to settle.
Right. Think about classical physics or evolutionary biology. The foundational texts, Newton's Principia, Darwin's Origin of Species, they were written generations ago.
Hundreds of years ago.
Yes. And we spent decades arguing over them, testing them, and finally letting them settle into solid concrete. You learn those fixed historical foundations in high school.
Yeah, that's true.
Then, maybe a decade later, in a specialized PhD program, you start engaging with the current state-of-the-art research. The two concepts, foundation and state-of-the-art, are separated by vast oceans of time.
They live in entirely different centuries.
But in generative AI, the velocity of discovery is so unprecedented that time has effectively collapsed on itself.
Time has collapsed. That is a heavy phrase.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like for the people doing the work?
Well, imagine being a researcher. You spend 8 months developing a completely novel way for a system to process visual data.
Right.
You publish it, it beats all the benchmarks, it is the undisputed state-of-the-art. But in this field, it only stays the reigning champion for maybe 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
Sometimes less. Because the moment you publish that SOTA paper, every other major lab on the planet reads it, reverse engineers your brilliant new methodology, and immediately uses it as the baseline for their own new experiments.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, your wild theoretical breakthrough from last month literally becomes the required essential building block for today's experiments.
Oh, wow. So your cutting edge roof just became someone else's floor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Suddenly, that 3-week-old SOTA paper is now a foundational text.
Yep.
If the next wave of researchers doesn't deeply understand the paper you published last month, they cannot even begin to comprehend the new soda papers coming out today.
That is wild.
The timeline from experimental theory to accepted foundation has shrunk from 100 years to 100 hours.
That wet concrete analogy is making so much more sense now. We are actively building on materials that haven't even finished curing yet. And it forces me to think about the psychological toll on the builders themselves. I mean, if you are a researcher, you have to be okay with the fact that your masterpiece is going to be obsolete almost immediately. You aren't building a monument, you are just handing off a baton.
A highly visible handoff, and because the baton is moving so incredibly fast, the only way to track the race is to watch those handoffs in real time.
Right.
That is what a soda paper represents in this context. It is the exact moment human knowledge is passed from one runner to the next.
Which brings us right back to the title of the excerpt, The Foundations and State of Generative AI Research. It unites those two seemingly contradictory words into a single breath.
It really does.
The author is telling us explicitly that you cannot understand the state of Gen AI without understanding its foundations. And paradoxically, its foundations are entirely made up of very recent state-of-the-art papers.
It forces a complete mental shift in how we approach learning itself. If you're trying to keep up with generative AI, you basically have to abandon the old educational model.
Yeah, you can't just buy a textbook, memorize a static set of rules, and call yourself an expert.
No, not at all. By the time a textbook on Gen AI is written, peer-reviewed, printed, and shipped to your house, its foundations are already historically obsolete.
The wet concrete has dried into the wrong shape.
Precisely. So, to engage with this field, you have to develop a completely different cognitive muscle. It is no longer about what you have memorized. It is about your capacity to continuously digest new information.
Right.
You have to learn how to read soda papers not as final, definitive answers to a problem, but as temporary waypoints.
Temporary waypoints. I love that. You aren't studying a map. You are mapping a moving territory.
Exactly.
And I think that's why the text places so much emphasis on the collaborative nature of this. If the foundations are constantly shifting, no single human brain can keep track of it all. It requires a community saying, hey, look at this new blueprint that just dropped this morning. We all need to adjust our building plans by tomorrow.
And that is the ultimate value of the sharing philosophy we started with. The author recognizes that the trajectory of generative AI isn't being dictated by a secret council in a closed room.
Yes.
It is being forged in the open, paper by paper, argument by argument. Engaging with those primary sources is an invitation to participate in the scientific process as it happens.
You don't have to wait for historians to tell you what was foundational.
Exactly. You are reading the foundations as they're being drafted.
So what does this all mean for you, navigating this space day to day? Let's bring this philosophical paradox back down to earth for a minute.
Good idea.
If you take one thing away from this deep dive, it should be a fundamental shift in your reading habits. We are surrounded by a deafening amount of noise. Every time you open your phone, there are like 1,000 think pieces telling you what this technology can do, what it will ruin, what it will save.
And much of that is just speculation built on top of other speculation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this text offers a completely different approach. To truly grasp generative AI, you have to bypass the secondary noise. You must engage directly with the state-of-the-art papers. Because those papers aren't just news updates. They are the very track being laid down in front of the moving train. You wonder where the train is going, you have to look at the people holding the hammers and laying the steel, read the papers.
And remember, you don't need to be a mathematician to do this. The knowledge is most valuable when you seek to understand the why and the how, not just the raw data.
Right. Skim for the big picture.
Look for the paradigm shifts. Look for how today's state-of-the-art is quietly becoming tomorrow's foundation.
It's about joining the conversation rather than just listening to rumors about it. But, as we wrap up today, I cannot shake that image we built at the very beginning. The 100-story skyscraper being built on wet, constantly mutating concrete.
It's a powerful image.
The text makes it undeniably clear. The foundations of generative AI are built entirely on state-of-the-art papers that are relentlessly shifting, evolving, and being replaced.
The bedrock is never allowed to settle.
Never. And that leaves me with a thought I want you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We are rapidly integrating this technology into our businesses, our creative workflows, and our daily lives. But if the very foundations of this technology are built on a rapidly shifting, ever-changing state-of-the-art, If the bedrock is quite literally always changing, how do we ever build something permanent?
That is the big question.
It really is something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.